Major Hiroshi Tanaka thought he understood American guns. He had drilled his men for years on how to dodge rifle fire, how to crawl under mortar arcs, how to close the distance before nerves broke. He believed war still belonged to the brave, to the men who charged, not the men who waited. But on a humid Pacific night in 1943, when he led his section toward a jungle ridge, he heard a sound no training had prepared him for, a deep, metallic thunder that rolled like a god tearing the sky apart. The first burst didn't just kill soldiers. It erased them. Limbs vanished. Helmets spun off heads that were no longer there. The air turned into a storm of invisible blades. Men were shredded before they could even scream. Tanaka froze, not from fear, but confusion. No weapon was supposed to do this. He crawled for cover and dared to raise his head. What he saw glowing at the ridgeline wasn't a squad. It was a silhouette of steel death bolted into the earth. A Browning heavy machine gun, fed by belts so long they spilled like iron rivers. In that moment he understood. This wasn't a battle. It was a sentence. Japan had entered the war believing courage could match firepower. But the weapon in front of him wasn't just stronger, it made courage irrelevant. And in the Pacific theater, that realization spread like a cold wind. America wasn't merely fighting the war. It was manufacturing inevitability. There is a myth that nations understand they're losing only when cities burn or flags fall. But empires don't break all at once. They crack in the minds of the men who first face a truth too large to deny. For Japan's infantry, that truth arrived not at the end of the war, but in the first shocking contact with American Browning fire. The early diaries of Japanese officers show a shift in tone. Before Guadalcanal, they wrote about glory. After Guadalcanal, they wrote about iron rain. Japan entered the Pacific convinced its infantry could close the gap faster than any Western soldier could shoot. That belief came from history, China, Russia, the Great War. In each, shock tactics worked. Soldiers who advanced without fear could break Europeans used to distance combat. But the Browning M1919 and especially the M2.50 cal were distance made permanent. They created a psychological wall as real as a fortress, but faster to assemble than sandbags. Picture the first encounters. A platoon moves silently through palm shadows. Moonlight glints off bayonets. A whisper of confidence. This will be another easy overrun. But then, an eruption. Not a burst like a rifle, not a chatter like a submachine gun, something closer to a saw blade chewing through the night itself. Men who had survived artillery broke under the pressure of something they couldn't see, couldn't flank, couldn't silence. Reports recovered after the war show commanders using words like the field became impossible, no avenue of advance existed, and most tellingly, we could not make them run. That last sentence was everything. Japan's strategy needed the enemy to break. But the Browning didn't panic, didn't waver, didn't run out of breath. The gun didn't feel fear, didn't tire, didn't flinch when men screamed and charged. It just kept carving. There was another shock Japan did not expect. The Americans had many of them. One gun was terrifying. 5 on interlocking fields of fire turned jungles into meat grinders. Japan had courage. America had multiplication. And inside those first confused minutes of contact, a terrible question took root among Japanese officers. A quiet one, never spoken aloud, but always present after. How do you fight a nation that builds bullets faster than you can bury your dead? That was the moment the real war began. Not the war of soldiers, but the war of systems. A war Japan could not win with spirit alone. And the Browning guns were only the opening lesson. Japan thought it was fighting a weapon. What it was actually fighting was a system. The Browning M1919 and M2 did not win battles simply because they were powerful. They won because they were designed to keep firing when every other weapon choked, overheated, or jammed. And that reliability wasn't an accident. It was philosophy turned into steel. John Moses Browning never built a gun. He built machines meant to outlast chaos. The M2, in particular, was not just strong. It was overbuilt on purpose. forged from the idea that war rewards endurance more than elegance. Heavy steel, thick barrels, a design so simple that muddy hands could field strip it in the dark. It looked primitive to foreign observers, until they realized primitive meant unbreakable. Where Japanese weapons were built like precision swords, finicky, elegant, bound to fail when pushed beyond tolerances, American Browning guns were built like anvils that spat thunder. And behind that steel sat the real weapon, logistics. Japan could build courage faster than America could build men. But America could build machines faster than Japan could build courage. The U.S. military wasn't just fielding weapons. It was fielding factories disguised as firepower. Every Browning gun on the front line had a chain stretching behind it. Steel foundries, machine shops, ammunition plants, men on night shifts turning or into death by the ton. One Japanese engineer captured after Saipan reportedly said, "We destroyed the gun team, but by morning they had 2 more guns. We could not kill the factory." This was the American war doctrine. If one weapon works, build 50,000 of it. If one approach saves lives, standardize it across an ocean. Not innovation, scalability. Not genius, repeatability. The M1919 filled every gap a battlefield could create. Mount on a jeep, bolt it to a ship's rail, drop it from the sky with a paratroop unit, set on a tripod in the jungle. The gun did not care where it lived. It simply worked. And then came its older, louder brother, the M2.50 caliber. To Japanese infantrymen, this was closer to artillery than a machine gun. Heavy rounds shattered palm trunks, tore through engine blocks, punched holes in armored cars. And yet, it was simple enough that a half-trained farm kid from Kansas could learn to service it after a 3-day crash course. Japan wasn't just outgunned. It was outmanufactured, outmaintained, and eventually outadapted. There is a photograph, rarely shown in textbooks, of an ordnance depot in 1943. Endless wooden crates of M2 receivers lined in rows so vast they vanish into the frame like train tracks. A caption reads, "Enough for 6 divisions, packed for shipping." Japan didn't have 6 divisions worth of spare heavy weapons for its entire empire. And those crates were only one day's output. American generals didn't plan to shock Japanese infantry psychology. But they did, because the Browning guns removed something Japan's doctrine depended on, the moment of hesitation before killing. A man with a rifle can panic. A team servicing an M2 cannot afford to. The gun won't let them. It demands rhythm, focus, routine. In some units, it was said the M2 didn't stop charges, it harvested them. So the question shifted. Inside Tokyo's war rooms, inside diaries, inside foxholes, was this still soldier versus soldier? Or was this industry versus belief? How do you flank a nation whose weapons are built to outlive your strategy? How do you break through when every breakthrough melts under a sheet of hot steel? The Japanese infantryman brought a rifle, a bayonet, and a prayer. The American infantryman brought a gun team and a factory. And the moment Japanese leadership realized the Browning guns weren't just better, but endless, the war stopped being symmetrical. Because if one empire fights with bravery and the other fights with production, what happens when the battlefield stops rewarding bravery at all? What happens when closing the distance, the very core of your doctrine, becomes suicide by concept? That is the psychological crack that widened into fear, then hesitation, then collapse. And that crack would be torn wide open once the guns met real combat. At Tarawa, Guadalcanal, and later Omaha Beach, where the Browning didn't just defend lines, it built them. The first time the Browning guns weren't just seen, but felt was Guadalcanal, the moment Spirit crashed head-on into machinery. Japanese infantry believed they could terrorize Marines by attacking at night, screaming through the trees with bayonets and blades meant to break enemy nerves. It had worked in China. It had worked in the Russo-Japanese War. Night was their ally. Confusion was their weapon. But the Browning M1919 stripped night of its advantage. Gun crews didn't need light. They needed sound, silhouette, movement. And once movement appeared, they sculpted darkness into a killing field. American Marines said the jungle itself seemed to glow when a Browning opened up. Muzzle flash bouncing off rain-wet, leaves like lightning trapped in branches. Survivors called it the furnace. Bodies did not fall. They peeled apart. A Japanese sergeant later wrote, "We advanced 10 steps, and then our number was half." The air became a blade. At Tarawa, the shock was reversed. Now it was the Americans crossing open space under fire. Except there was a crucial difference. Once the landing stalled and Japanese machine guns carved the beach, it wasn't heroism that shifted the tide. It was the M2. Marines dragged the massive guns off landing craft, bolted them to makeshift mounts, and turned raw beachfront into a thunder platform. The Japanese bunkers, terrifying moments before suddenly met a weapon with range, and bite their walls could not survive. The M2 chewed through sandbags, through palm logs, through iron. It erased cover as a concept. This is what terrified Japanese commanders most. The Browning guns didn't answer tactics, they deleted them. Close the gap. You die before step 10. Build cover. It melts. Hide behind terrain. The half-inch slug ignores the terrain. Courage, which had fueled doctrine for generations, was amputated from the equation. One Marine lieutenant described watching a Japanese charge at Guadalcanal. They came in a wave. Brave, loud, determined. Then he pointed to his gun crew. 5 seconds. That's how long bravery lasted that night. And slowly, a terrible asymmetry settled in. American fear was logistical. Will I have enough ammunition before the next push? Japanese fear became existential. Will I still exist by the time I reach them? That is when psychology began to rot from the inside. Japanese commanders tried everything: speed, stealth, coordinated rushes, crawling the mud to close assault gun pits with grenades. Nothing solved the fundamental math problem. A Browning gun didn't need accuracy. It needed direction. The volume of fire was the weapon. You didn't aim death at a man, you washed his position in it. And behind those guns were teenagers from farms, welders from Detroit, boys still smelling of factory oil and tobacco, not professional killers. Yet Browning steel made them immovable. Tarawa became a symbol. The Japanese thought they built a fortress. The Americans landed with something worse, a portable fortress that barked thunder. The M2 wasn't just a tool. It was a statement of reality carved in brass. Its rhythm, boom, 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 became a heartbeat of inevitability. After-action diaries from surviving officers show the same recurring line: we cannot reach them. Not won't, not fear to, but cannot. And a soldier who believes he cannot reach his enemy has entered a new form of defeat, not tactical, but ideological. At this point in the war, Western analysts still describe the Pacific as evenly matched. But in the minds of the men who fought face-to-face, the truth had already shifted. The Japanese infantryman was no longer fighting a Marine in a foxhole. He was fighting a machine that turned foxholes into miniature fortresses. He was fighting a gun that did not blink, did not sweat, did not lose morale, did not stand down. He was fighting industrial permanence, which leads to the next chilling transition in this war psychology. Once Japan realized the Browning could not be neutralized directly, they began searching for ways to go around reality itself. But how do you outthink a weapon designed to erase your thinking before you finish a plan? When courage fails, one question remains. If you cannot beat the weapon, can you outrun what it represents? That desperate shift from bravery to improvisation would trigger the next phase of the war. When Japanese high command finally accepted that courage alone could not close the distance, their focus shifted to a desperate question. If we cannot stop the Browning, can we survive it long enough to hit back? The answer was a race against inevitability. The first idea was armor. Improvised steel plates welded to field guns, bunker faces stacked with extra palm trunks, even metal scavenged from wrecks. But the M2 was not a rifle. The .50 caliber round ripped through those defenses like an axe through wet bark. Bunkers meant to absorb punishment shattered. Ammunition dumps detonated from a single well-placed strike. Even light tanks, proud symbols of Japanese mechanization, became coffins once a Browning found their engine vents. Next came stealth. Japan tried night infiltration raids, low crawling, and single-man suicide rushes to grenade gun nests. They studied American crews, disciplined, calm, practiced, and tried to disrupt them by targeting the gunner first. But the Browning crews were trained like a living chain. Kill one, another stepped up. Jam the barrel, they swapped it. Run them dry. More belts arrived like veins refilling blood. You could kill the man, but the machine survived the night. So Japan turned to terrain. Inland jungles, ravines, cave fortification networks, anything that removed the straight lines of fire that Browning guns fed on. For a moment, it worked. Ambushes and volcanic ridges cost American lives. But even there, firepower adapted faster than strategy. The Browning was mounted on boats to rake shoreline cliffs, mounted on tanks to collapse cave mouths, mounted on aircraft to strafe tree lines before infantry even arrived. Every countermeasure forced the same terrible realization: America wasn't reacting. It was iterating. When a tactic broke, the factory updated the battlefield like a patch to a game Japan had no means to edit. And the psychological weight sharpened. You weren't fighting soldiers anymore. You were fighting manufacturing momentum. By late 1944, captured Japanese briefings spoke not of defeating Browning positions, but of avoiding them. That is not battlefield doctrine. That is surrender written in slow motion. One chilling intercept read, "Offensive doctrine ineffective where American heavy guns mass. Seek alternate approach or delay engagement." But in island warfare, there was no alternate route. The sea, the jungle, the ridge, all ended under the same half-inch rain. The most telling adaptation came not from tactics or steel, but from language. Japanese soldiers began calling Browning gun crews iron gatekeepers, not enemies, obstacles of reality. When a weapon graduates from dangerous to inevitable, morale collapses long before the body does. Some officers tried to counter psychologically, telling troops the Brownings were unreliable, easily overheated, vulnerable to shock assault. But diaries show the opposite belief setting in. The Browning never died. Men would swear the guns somehow moved faster than humans could carry them, as if the jungle breathed them into place overnight. In truth, that was just logistics again. Preposition caches, spare tripods, vehicle mounts, recovery crews. When one gun went down, two more arrived. Machines replaced machines faster than Japan could replace men. Technology did not just win firefights. It won time. And time is the one weapon a fading empire cannot resupply. Japanese command began asking a darker question. If we can no longer approach the enemy and cannot hide from his gunfire, what future does our doctrine have? That question hung over the final island campaigns like smoke. Because when a nation realizes its war has become mathematically unwinnable, its defeat is no longer about territory. It is about the moment belief dies. The final chapter is not about tactics, it is about legacy. What happens when a single design becomes so perfect it outlives entire empires? Most weapons win battles and then fade into museums. The Browning did the opposite. It survived its enemies. And it survived its century. When the Pacific War ended, Japan's officers didn't write about MacArthur first, or the bomb, or even the surrender documents. In their post-war reports, many referenced a quieter humiliation. We never found a way to break the American gun line. Not metaphorically, literally. Across hundreds of engagements, no doctrine emerged that consistently neutralized Browning fire. That is not a tactical failure. That is a civilizational mismatch. Because what Japan finally understood was this: the M1919 and M2 were not built to win a war. They were built to win wars as a category. Where Japanese doctrine said the individual's spirit triumphs, the Browning reflected a different theology: systems triumph. Even after surrender, American commanders reported that Japanese prisoners wanted to see the guns again, touch them, examine them, try to understand how something so plain could be so final. They expected sorcery. They found steel and geometry. That is the legacy. The M2 has now fired in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. A single design bridging generations of conflict, still relevant, still feared, still unchanged in principle. Not because it was the most elegant, but because it was the most repeatable. The longest-lived machine gun in active U.S. service. A century old, still deployed. An empire died, the gun did not. It teaches a brutal lesson about war. The battlefield does not reward passion, or sacrifice, or myth. It rewards whatever can fire tomorrow. Japan entered World War II believing courage was the ultimate renewable resource. America answered with a darker truth. Machinery is more renewable than men. And so the psychological wound outlived the fighting. Japan rebuilt as a manufacturing giant not by chance, but by reaction. They learned what had defeated them, not just guns, but the ability to build them endlessly. Post-war industry was not cultural change. It was survival instinct turned inward. The Browning was not just a weapon. It was a prophecy of the world to come. Because in every war since, the victor is not the army that bleeds less, but the army that stops running out. The last thing the Japanese infantry saw was a fortress made of noise. The last thing history saw was a doctrine made obsolete. And the question that lingers is the one no battlefield monument can answer. What chance does courage have when the other side can manufacture inevitability? War remembers heroes, but history remembers what endured. Japan's courage faded. The Browning never did. If you'd like to explore more hidden turning points, the moments where machines, not speeches, rewrote destiny, stay with this channel. The next story begins where this one leaves the battlefield behind.